I'm tired of seeing all the beginner briskets and Texas briskets. They're great, but there are other ways to cook them, and today we're gonna do a bit more of an advanced brisket, so let's get into this right now. What we've got here is what's labeled as a 9-pound full packer brisket. Now that's a pretty small brisket. Normally for competitions, I start at 15 pounds and go up to 20, but this one will do just fine for today. We just gotta see what we've got here. Unfortunately for me, this cryovac popped a hole in it, so that's why we're doing this a little bit earlier than I would have liked to. It's still a little bit more frozen than I would have liked, but for trimming, that kind of helps us out, so we'll just roll with it. Now, you've seen me take apart a competition brisket before, and you know that my stance on briskets is if you're gonna cook a brisket, separate the point and the flat. But right off the bat, there's something different about this. It's still a little bit rigid, so we'll take off as much fat as we can, but I'm gonna reserve the right to trim this up some more tomorrow, right before it goes on the smoker. But as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking maybe we'll leave the flat and the point attached because it's a little thin. However, when I go to trim the fat off the point, it's the flat. So what it looks like happened is the packing plant took most of the point off of this brisket. This is mainly a flat, I think. So as such, we're gonna treat this just like it's a big, wide flat. So we're gonna try to keep it pretty level. Again, it's kind of hard to do today. When it thaws tomorrow, we can make any adjustments we need to, but we're gonna go ahead and try to keep it trimmed down. If you go too deep and accidentally expose the meat, don't worry, just keep the piece trimmed off, use it as a shim. That's a competition trick. But yeah, we're not gonna worry about trimming this up super tight. This is technically an eating brisket. I hate that term, by the way, eating barbecue versus competition barbecue. That's a topic for a different subject. But light trim, sticking mainly with what I've showed you before. And then we're gonna inject this thing up. Because it is a choice grade brisket, it looks a little bit thin, could use some help. We're just gonna mix up some Cosmos Q Reserve blend according to the package instructions. We're gonna hit this brisket with the grain. And the thing about injecting meat is it'll only take so much. So go in your standard inch by inch grid pattern, but when you start seeing liquid come back out of the brisket, it's not gonna take any more in that location. And then because I'm not sure if there's point meat under there or not, I'm gonna go ahead and drive one deep and start injecting a little bit through there. Worst case, I'm injecting fat, which doesn't matter. Best case, there's some point down there and we'll find it. I'm gonna cover this up and put this in the refrigerator overnight. Normally I'd season it up right now too, but because I expect it to thaw a little bit more and sort of loosen up, I'm probably gonna trim it a little bit more tomorrow. We're not gonna season it yet, we'll season it tomorrow morning. It's not a big deal. And just like magic, this thing let go. It's honestly pretty decently shaped. I am gonna take a little bit more of this fat off the top. I am gonna round it out just a touch more. You can always round until your heart's content. Don't worry about it too much. The way we're gonna cook this, it will make it like a football. So any weirdness, don't get too hung up about it. We're gonna cook it out. On the bottom, we're just gonna go with Cosmos Q Dirty Bird just to instill some of the classic barbecue flavor. Now on the meat side, we're gonna go with Cosmos Q Cow Cover Hot. It's a classic beef rub. Savoriness, some heat because it's the hot version. If you don't want the spicy, get the not hot version. We're gonna cover that up with the Cosmos Q SPG, which may be the biggest staple to beef barbecue to me. I love how coarse this is, how it comes out, the look when it falls on, it's just great. And then lastly, for color, we're gonna come right back over the top again with some more of that Cosmos Q Dirty Bird. Now while this starts to sweat out, we're gonna fill our charcoal hopper on our Gravity 980 with some B&B Hickory Lump Charcoal. It's my favorite. And this is my competition brisket smoker. This thing has 2 180s in brisket, 4 brisket wins on it over the past 12 months. It's a brisket machine. We're gonna go ahead and light it off using the Grill Gun by Grill Blazer. And if you don't have one of these, you definitely want it. And there's a 10% discount link in the description below. And we're gonna bring this cooker up to 400 degrees. Now normally I would go to 440 and we may later, but because it's a little bit thinner, I'm gonna take it a little bit easier on it. We're gonna start it at 400 and see what it does with the fat render. Now just 5 minutes before we put this brisket on, I'm gonna add a fistful pretty much of B&B hickory chunks and 1 chunk of B&B cherry. I like to bank all of my wood to the side away from the flap just to avoid any unnecessary heat. And those 5 minutes will be plenty of time to get those wood chunks smoking. In 5 minutes, we get the brisket on, and this first hour to me is what makes or breaks a brisket cook of this magnitude. Here's the thing about a hot and fast brisket cook. The low and slow guys, the Texas style briskets, Jeremy over at Mad Scientist. Low and slow has its value. It gives everything much more time to break down, so you'll get a lot more of a concentration of beefy flavor. On a hot and fast cook, you may skip over some of that, so we do some things to bring in that flavor, and in turn we get some different things like a grease stripping flavor, basically a steaky kind of flavor. We get the meat expanded and puffed out because of the high heat working on that moisture in the protein. I really just want to show you another option for what you can achieve with this hot and fast competition style brisket that you don't necessarily get with a Lone Slow. This first hour is uber important, especially this high temperature. Once you're on, every 10 minutes, I'm going to spray this brisket with water. Now the first 10 and the second 10, it's still pretty moist because it's sweating out. So don't hit it too hard or you'll wash the rub off. And actually after that second one, we're not getting quite as much fat render as I want to hear. So we're gonna go ahead and bump this up to 440. Now as time goes on, the third, fourth, fifth spray, you'll notice the edges start to get the darkest. So definitely hit the edges the most with the water. You'll also notice this thing has puffed up and taken on a football-like shape. That's exactly what I want. But if we've noticed a spot where we get some pulling, the classic trick of just take a piece of wood, shove it under there, and shim it up. Shim it up however you want. You can use fat trimmings from the brisket, you can use meat trimmings from the brisket, you can use a piece of wood, but the main point is to keep that top nice and flat or domed up. And at 1 hour, this thing looks absolutely beautiful. I love it. To me, the brisket cook is almost done at this point. We still have to keep an eye on it, we still have to finish the cook, but we've done the hard thing. We've done the non-beginner aspect of it. Now we're gonna bump this Char-Griller Gravity 980 down to 320 and let it cruise for 2 more hours. Just soaking up smoke and getting right. After 2 more hours, we've been 3 hours on the cooker uncovered. We're gonna get a large foil pan now, put a little bit more of our Dirty Bird rub down, and slap that beautiful brisket into this pan. It looks amazing right now. I love how a piece of barbecue looks right before you wrap it. It's always the pinnacle of what it's gonna look like. We're gonna add in some liquid. You can choose whatever you want. A lot of guys like beef consomme. Today I just have some beef broth handy, so I'm gonna put in some beef broth, basically just covering the bottom of this pan. We need to give it enough liquid to where it'll steam and braise this brisket. Put it back on the Gravity 980 for another roughly 3 hours. I like to put a probe in it and I'll start checking it at about 208 degrees internal, but you want this to feel so soft. So here's the best I can do for you. Do you see how when I pull the probe out, the brisket wants to come with it? It feels good going in, but when I pull it, tries to tug. That's not done. As opposed to, I don't want that brisket to move when I pull the probe out. At that point, we are done. It's been 3 hours in the smoke, 3.5 hours in the wrap. Just gonna let it rest for however long you want to. But when it is time on the cutting board, I love revealing how much of a smoke ring this Gravity will throw on a brisket. Now this is a little bit of a thinner flat, but it is tender, it's nice and moist. Nothing left to do but give this a try and see how we did. All right, here we go. It's tender, it's juicy, it's full of beefy flavor. It's got that smokiness, you know you're not dealing with pot roast. That's the biggest fear when you're cooking a brisket, is putting all that time and work into it and having it just come out like a pot roast. This did not. It's exactly what you would expect to be a delicious smoked brisket. This one was kind of weird with that point piece underneath of it, but turned out just to be a pretty big flat, a little thin, but nothing crazy. Great deal from the grocery store. This is why you always scrutinize the meat department. Doesn't cost you any extra to go back there and take a look at what's there. So now that we've handled a small brisket, why don't you beam over here, let's talk about how to tackle a large brisket.